For most people today, a carpet is something you vacuum once a week and vaguely promise to replace someday. It lies there quietly, collecting dust, crumbs, and the occasional regret. In the Ottoman Empire, though, carpets were not background objects. They were time-consuming companions. They absorbed years, sometimes decades. Entire lives passed knot by knot, color by color, with no particular rush to get anywhere. Empires rose and fell at a respectable pace, and the carpets kept growing anyway. The weavers were not in a hurry. History, for once, agreed to slow down with them. If you enjoy this kind of extremely patient history, feel free to subscribe. And if you're listening right now, you can leave a comment with your city and the local time. It's always quietly interesting to see where people are drifting off from. Chapter 1. The room where time moved sideways. Before we really begin, this is a good moment to settle in. Adjust whatever needs adjusting. Let the room do what rooms do at night. Nothing urgent is coming. The Ottoman Empire can wait. It's been waiting for centuries already. The space where an Ottoman carpet was woven was rarely impressive. It was not a grand hall filled with inspiration. More often, it was a low room with uneven floors, light leaking in from a small window that was never quite clean. The loom dominated the space. It stood there like a polite piece of furniture that refused to be ignored. Wood beams, worn smooth by hands that had passed over them for years, sometimes generations. The weaver arrived early, not because anyone demanded it, but because daylight mattered. Oil lamps were expensive. Candles were worse. So the sun was treated with professional respect. Shoes were often left at the edge of the room. Not ceremonially, just practically. Dirt and fine wool fibers did not mix well. Sitting down at the loom was not dramatic. It was a slow lowering of the body onto a bench or cushion that had already shaped itself to someone else's posture long ago. The loom creaked, just enough to remind everyone involved that it was old and would remain that way. Carpet weaving in the Ottoman world was not one job. It was dozens of regional habits pretending to be a single tradition. In Anatolia, in Western Persia, in the Balkans, techniques shifted slightly from village to village. Patterns changed. Colors came and went. But the rhythm stayed the same. Not pull, tighten, cut, and again. A single square inch could hold hundreds of knots. No one counted them individually. Counting would have made the work feel longer. Instead, progress was measured by lines, by rows, by the slow migration of the pattern upward as the carpet grew from the bottom edge. The weaver's hands learned the work in a way that bypassed conscious thought. Fingers reached for the correct thread before the mind bothered to name the color. Red was not just red. It was madder red, or cochineal red, or that slightly faded red from a batch of dye that had been stretched further than intended. Mistakes happened. Quietly. A wrong knot here. A shade slightly off there. These were rarely corrected unless they disrupted the structure. Perfection was not the goal. Completion was. And while that quietly carried on, the rest of life arranged itself around the loom. Meals were simple. Bread, olives, sometimes cheese. Something hot if time allowed. Tea arrived later in Ottoman history, but when it did, it was welcomed without hesitation. Coffee too, though not always during work hours. Spilled coffee was a tragedy no one needed. Children were present. They learned by watching long before they were allowed to touch the loom. At first, they were assigned harmless tasks. Fetching yarn, sorting colors, sitting nearby and absorbing the idea that this was what time looked like when it was behaving properly. Payment for weaving was rarely immediate. Many carpets were made on commission, but the money arrived slowly, if at all. Some carpets were woven for households, dowries, mosques. Others were destined for markets far away, though the weaver might never know exactly where. Venice, somewhere with stone buildings and impatient buyers. The Ottoman state, vast and bureaucratic, mostly ignored individual weavers. Taxes existed, of course. They always did. But the loom itself was beneath imperial concern. This invisibility was both a burden and a kind of freedom. No one from the palace was coming to check the speed of your knots. Days blended together. The pattern advanced. Seasons shifted subtly, measured by how the light entered the room and how cold the fingers felt in the morning. Let's drift over to the materials themselves, because they were never incidental. Wool was cleaned by hand, washed in cold water, beaten against rocks, laid out to dry where animals could be kept away. It carried the smell of the sheep long after it was spun. This was not considered a flaw. It was simply honest. Dyes came from plants, insects, minerals. Preparing them took nearly as much patience as weaving. Roots were boiled. Insects were crushed. Liquids simmered until the color looked right, which was an entirely subjective decision made by someone who had seen enough dye baths to trust their eyes. Yarn soaked, absorbed, darkened, lightened as it dried. Predictability was limited. A good dyer learned to accept small surprises. Once dyed, the yarn waited, sometimes for months. There was no rush to begin. Rushing only led to shortages later, and no one enjoyed discovering they had run out of a specific shade halfway through a border pattern. The loom held the warp threads under tension. These vertical threads were the skeleton of the carpet. If they were uneven, everything suffered. So they were set carefully, adjusted, checked again, and then left alone. The weft threads passed horizontally, locking the knots in place. Their job was quiet. They were rarely seen in the finished work, and that was exactly the point. Ottoman carpets were not designed to be stared at closely for long periods. They were meant to exist underfoot, to be walked on, to be worn down slowly. This knowledge shaped everything. Durability mattered more than subtlety. And so the weaver worked, day after day, not thinking in terms of weeks or months, but in terms of what portion of the pattern would be completed before the light faded. News traveled slowly into the weaving room. Wars happened somewhere else. Sultans changed. Borders shifted. The loom did not react. It stayed where it was. If a caravan passed through town, there might be new gossip, new prices, rumors of demand rising or falling. Sometimes this influenced color choices on future carpets. Sometimes it didn't. Predicting markets was never reliable enough to reorganize your entire life. As the carpet grew longer, it became heavier. Rolling it up was a task. Unrolling it again required space that many rooms did not have. Some carpets were woven in sections, then joined. This was done carefully, invisibly, by hands that understood how much tension thread could tolerate before breaking. Mistakes, again, were accepted. A slightly crooked line did not ruin a carpet. It simply proved that a human had been there. By evening, hands ached. Backs complained. Eyes strained. There was no dramatic end to the workday. The weaver stopped when the light was no longer useful. The loom waited patiently through the night. Chapter 2: The Patience of Hands That Never Traveled. By the time a second carpet began, the hands already knew what to expect. They did not feel hopeful or tired in advance. They simply showed up. Fingers wrapped around familiar threads. The body adjusted itself to the same narrow range of movement it had used for years. There was comfort in that limitation. No surprises were required. Most Ottoman carpet weavers never left their village. Some never left their street. Travel was expensive, unnecessary, and usually uncomfortable. The world came to them in fragments instead. A merchant passing through. A sample pattern copied from memory. A story about colors preferred somewhere far away, which might or might not be accurate. This lack of travel shaped the carpets more than any imperial decree. Patterns repeated because repetition worked. A border design that had survived 3 generations was unlikely to suddenly fail in the 4th. Innovation happened slowly, if at all. And when it did, it usually arrived quietly, disguised as a minor adjustment. A slightly wider vine. A flower with an extra petal. A corner motif rotated just enough to be noticeable only to someone who had been staring at carpets for decades. The weaver did not think in terms of art history. There was no internal monologue about legacy. The carpet needed to be structurally sound. It needed to look balanced when laid flat. Everything beyond that was secondary. Workdays stretched long in winter, shorter in summer. In hot months, weaving slowed. Wool stuck to skin. Fingers slipped. Sweat darkened the yarn if care was not taken. Windows were opened, then regretted when dust drifted in. In colder seasons, hands stiffened. Knots took longer. The loom felt less forgiving. Some weavers wore finger guards made of leather or cloth. Others didn't bother. Pain was not dramatic enough to interrupt the work. Children grew up beside the loom without formal instruction. They learned by proximity, by watching how adults corrected tension without stopping to think, by noticing which colors were set aside for borders and which were reserved for the field. Girls were more often trained than boys, though this varied by region. In some households, everyone wove. In others, weaving was considered women's work, with men involved only in shearing, dyeing, or selling. None of this was standardized. The Ottoman Empire was excellent at taxation and record-keeping when it felt like it. Carpet weaving mostly fell outside those instincts. As long as taxes were paid and no one caused trouble, the loom could continue uninterrupted. Carpet designs often carried meanings that were explained later by scholars who were not present at the time. To the weaver, symbols were practical. This shape went here because it fit. That color worked because there was enough of it. If a motif represented fertility, protection, or eternity, it did so quietly. No one stopped mid-knot to reflect on symbolism. That would have slowed things down. And while that quietly carried on, the markets waited. Carpets moved slowly once completed. They were rolled, wrapped, loaded onto animals, stored in warehouses that smelled like wool, dust, and old wood. Some sat there for years before being sold. Others traveled farther than their makers ever would. A carpet woven in a small Anatolian town might end up in a mosque, a palace, or under a table somewhere entirely unremarkable. The weaver would never know. This absence of closure was normal. Work was released into the world without ceremony. Payment, when it came, was modest. Enough to keep going, rarely enough to stop. Some weavers worked on commission for workshops. Others worked independently, selling through intermediaries. The workshop system brought a slightly different rhythm. More deadlines, more uniform patterns, less personal variation. Even then, urgency remained relative. A carpet could not be rushed beyond a certain point. Wool resisted haste. Knots demanded consistency. A rushed hand made weak work, and weak carpets did not sell well. Guilds existed in cities. They regulated quality, training, and sometimes prices. Rural weavers operated mostly beyond their reach. This separation created differences that modern experts enjoy categorizing. At the time, it was simply geography. The Ottoman state appreciated carpets as diplomatic gifts. Lavish ones, dense with silk and gold thread. These were made by specialized artisans under very different conditions. They worked in imperial workshops. Their names were sometimes recorded. The vast majority of carpet weavers were anonymous. This anonymity was complete. No signatures, no dates, no personal marks beyond the slight irregularities in tension that a trained eye might recognize as human. Days passed. Patterns grew. The weaver's posture rarely improved with age. Backs curved, necks stiffened. Vision declined slowly. Some weavers adjusted by moving closer to the loom. Others relied on memory more than sight. When eyesight failed completely, some continued working on simpler designs. Others shifted roles. Teaching, sorting yarn, supervising without touching the knots themselves. There was no retirement in the modern sense. You stopped weaving when you could no longer weave. Until then, the loom remained part of daily life. Social life happened around the work. Conversations unfolded slowly, with pauses dictated by hand movements. Silence was not awkward. It was expected. Words filled the spaces that did not need hands. Stories repeated. News recycled. Complaints softened by familiarity. And while that quietly carried on, carpets accumulated in the world. They layered floors, covered benches, hung on walls for insulation. They softened sound, held warmth, absorbed spills. They wore down gradually, without protest. A good carpet aged well. Colors mellowed, wool softened. Patterns blurred slightly at the edges. This was considered success, not failure. Some carpets outlived their makers by centuries. They survived fires, moves, changing tastes. Others disappeared quickly, cut down, used, discarded when no longer useful. The weaver did not plan for permanence. Planning required optimism, and optimism was unnecessary. By the time a third carpet began, the rhythm felt even more inevitable. Hands moved without instruction. The loom accepted the work. Chapter 3: Colors that took longer than the empire itself. By the time the third carpet was underway, color had become less of a decision and more of a negotiation. Not between people, but between materials. Wool had its own preferences. Dyes behaved differently depending on the season, the water, and the mood of the person preparing them. No two batches were ever truly identical, no matter how carefully they were made to pretend otherwise. Red was the most demanding. It always was. Madder root needed time. It needed patience. It needed to be chopped, soaked, boiled, cooled, and boiled again. Anyone hoping for quick results usually ended up with something closer to pink, which was tolerated but never admired. The good reds took days to prepare and years to fully settle into themselves. Blue came from indigo, which arrived through long trade routes and even longer stories. Indigo did not announce its final color immediately. Wool emerged from the dye bath looking greenish, almost disappointed in itself. Only after exposure to air did it slowly deepen into blue. This transformation was quietly satisfying, though no one ever lingered to admire it for long. There was work to do. Yellow was easier. Plants provided it generously. It faded faster, but everyone knew that. Yellow motifs were placed thoughtfully, often in areas that would see less wear. This was not artistic foresight. It was practical experience repeating itself. Black was rarely true black. It was very dark brown, very dark blue, or the result of layering dyes until the color stopped arguing. Pure black weakened wool. It made fibers brittle, so it was used carefully, sparingly, or not at all. And while that quietly carried on, the empire expanded, contracted, reorganized, and taxed. The Ottoman Empire was enormous, but it functioned unevenly. Some regions felt its presence constantly, others barely noticed. Carpet weavers tended to fall into the second category. Their interaction with authority was indirect. Taxes were collected by someone who did not care how the carpet was made, only that money appeared eventually. Occasionally, officials commissioned carpets for mosques or administrative buildings. These requests arrived with specifications, size, color preferences, deadlines that sounded urgent but were understood flexibly. No one expected miracles. Even the state respected the limits of wool. Religious spaces required restraint. Designs avoided overt imagery. Geometry flourished. Repetition became devotion by default. The weaver followed patterns that had already proven acceptable, safe, and familiar. Prayer rugs were smaller, more personal. They were woven with attention but not reverence in the modern sense. They were tools. They were meant to be used daily, folded, carried, placed on uncertain ground. The weaver did not pray more intensely because of the rug. The rug simply did its job. Markets shifted quietly over decades. European demand increased. Preferences changed. Some buyers wanted finer knots. Others wanted bolder patterns. These signals traveled slowly inland. By the time they arrived, they were often outdated. Adaptation happened anyway. Slowly, borders became narrower. Fields became more open. Colors adjusted to suit distant tastes that no one had seen firsthand. Some weavers resisted change by accident rather than intention. They continued doing what they had always done because it worked. Their carpets sold eventually, or they didn't. Either way, weaving continued. Carpet weaving required memory more than innovation. Patterns were stored in the hands, not on paper. Cartoon designs existed in workshops, but many rural weavers relied on internal templates built over years. This made teaching difficult to formalize. Instructions were vague. Like this: "No, tighter. You'll feel it." Apprentices nodded, unsure, and learned anyway. Mistakes were part of training. A misaligned border, a flower that leaned slightly. These errors were rarely corrected. They served as reminders. And while that quietly carried on, The physical toll accumulated. Hands thickened. Calluses formed and reformed. Small cuts healed poorly in winter. Wool fibers lodged under skin and stayed there. Shoulders developed a permanent forward slope. The body adapted without asking permission. There were remedies. Warm water. Simple oils. Rest when possible. But rest was not structured. It happened between tasks, not instead of them. Illness interrupted weaving briefly. Rarely permanently. A fever might pause the loom for days. A more serious injury might require assistance. Family stepped in. Work resumed as soon as it could. Death, when it came, did not stop the loom for long. Another pair of hands took over. The pattern continued. Knots did not care who tied them. Some carpets were completed by people who had not started them. This was common. No one made a note of it. Time inside the weaving room felt different from time outside. Days were repetitive but not identical. Progress was visible but slow. The carpet grew upward, row by row, like a calendar that measured effort instead of dates. Festivals interrupted work. Briefly, holidays arrived, were observed, and passed. Weaving resumed. The loom waited without complaint. Music sometimes accompanied the work. Singing happened, though not always. Songs were repetitive, suited to the rhythm of hands. They did not demand attention. They filled space gently. Silence returned just as easily. And while that quietly carried on, finished carpets accumulated reputations. Certain regions became known for certain styles. Konya. These names meant something to buyers far away. To the weavers, they were simply places where people wove in familiar ways. Fame, when it existed, belonged to regions, not individuals. A good carpet reflected well on its origin, not its maker. Collectors would later assign dates, values, significance. They would analyze knots per inch and debate symbolism. None of this mattered at the loom. What mattered was tension, consistency, not running out of a specific shade too early. As the third carpet neared completion, the end approached slowly. There was no final sprint. Borders took time. Finishing knots were careful. The fringe was secured. Loose ends were trimmed. The last row did not feel special. It felt expected. The carpet was cut free from the loom. This moment was practical, not emotional. It was heavy. It was folded. It occupied space. The loom stood empty again. Briefly, Chapter 4. The sound a loom makes when nothing else is happening. By the fourth carpet, sound became part of the work in a way that no one ever discussed. The loom made noises that were not loud enough to notice at first, but impossible to forget once learned. A soft wooden knock as the weft was pressed into place. A faint scrape when the comb was lifted and lowered. The dull snip of thread being cut, repeated hundreds of times an hour. These sounds formed a background that replaced clocks. Time was not measured by bells or calls or schedules. It was measured by how often the loom answered the hands. In villages where several looms operated at once, the sound leaked through walls. It blended with footsteps, animals, distant voices. You could tell when someone was working without seeing them. Silence meant absence, or illness, or simply a pause for food. And while that quietly carried on, the idea of urgency remained absent. No one expected a carpet to be finished quickly. Asking when it would be done was considered mildly rude, like asking when someone planned to age. The answer was always some version of, when it's finished, delivered without defensiveness. This attitude baffled merchants from faster economies. They negotiated anyway. They learned to wait, or they moved on. Some tried to impose deadlines. These were acknowledged politely and ignored gently. Wool did not respond well to pressure. Neither did people who had been doing the same task for most of their lives. The loom encouraged stillness. You could not pace while weaving. You could not multitask aggressively. Your body learned to remain where it was. Movement was limited to what the pattern required. This stillness did strange things to attention. Thoughts wandered freely. Memories surfaced without invitation. Old conversations replayed. Songs repeated themselves in the mind long after voices stopped singing. For many weavers, this was the only uninterrupted thinking time they ever had. Not that thinking was the goal. It simply happened. Some weavers talked to themselves quietly. Others didn't. No one commented either way. And while that quietly carried on, the household adjusted. Weaving rooms doubled as living spaces. Visitors stepped around looms carefully. Furniture was arranged to accommodate them. The loom was not moved for guests. Guests adapted instead. Meals were eaten nearby. Threads were brushed aside. Care was taken not to spill. Accidents still happened. Spilled soup was cleaned. Wool absorbed smells and remembered them. Carpets were rarely woven in isolation. Even when a single person did the knotting, the work was supported by others. Someone prepared yarn. Someone cooked. Someone fetched water. The loom anchored a small ecosystem of quiet cooperation. This labor was not always recognized as such. It was simply life happening near a large wooden frame. Children eventually graduated to the loom. Their first attempts were clumsy. Tension uneven. Knots too loose or too tight. Adults corrected without explanation. Hands guided hands. Words were unnecessary. Praise was minimal. Improvement was expected. Mistakes were endured. Unraveling took time. Sometimes errors were left in place because fixing them would cost more effort than they were worth. These decisions were practical, not philosophical. And while that quietly carried on, seasons passed through the room. In spring, light lingered longer. Windows were opened cautiously. Fresh air mixed with wool dust. Sneezing increased. Work continued. In summer, heat slowed everything. Breaks were longer. Water was consumed steadily. Tempers shortened slightly, then settled back into neutrality. Autumn brought relief. Fingers moved more easily. Dyes behaved better. Progress felt smoother, though no faster. Winter compressed the room inward. Windows closed. Light faded early. Oil lamps flickered. Shadows lengthened across the loom. Work shortened but did not stop. Cold made the wool less cooperative. Knots resisted tightening. Fingers went numb. Breath fogged briefly in the morning. No one complained excessively. Complaining did not help. And while that quietly carried on, carpets became markers of time in other people's lives. A wedding carpet. A dowry piece. Something woven while waiting for a child to be born. Something completed after someone had already left. Carpets witnessed conversations they did not understand. Arguments. Reconciliations. Long silences. They lay beneath feet that aged. Feet that shuffled more slowly. Feet that eventually stopped coming. Carpets absorbed wear unevenly. Pathways formed where people walked most often. Patterns faded there first. This was not repaired. It was accepted as evidence of use. A carpet that remained pristine for too long was suspicious. It meant no one lived fully in that space. The weaver understood this. They did not expect immortality from their work. Longevity was enough. And while that quietly carried on, the outside world developed faster tools. Metal tools improved. Transportation quickened. Clocks became more common. Time began asserting itself more aggressively in some places. The weaving room resisted these changes. Not actively. It simply did not accommodate them easily. A clock on the wall was unnecessary. The loom already told you when to stop. Attempts to mechanize weaving appeared elsewhere. Looms with pedals. Systems with multiple workers. Increased output. These developments arrived slowly in Ottoman territories and were met with cautious interest. Mechanization produced more carpets. It did not always produce better ones. The trade-off was noted without enthusiasm. Hand-woven carpets retained value precisely because they took so long. Time itself was part of the material. Merchants understood this. Buyers did too, eventually. And while that quietly carried on, the weaver aged. Posture stiffened further. Fingers bent slightly at rest. Movements became economical. Nothing was wasted. Even effort was rationed. The loom adjusted. It did not require speed. It accepted whatever pace was offered. Some weavers developed preferences late in life. Certain colors they enjoyed more. Certain patterns they avoided. These preferences were indulgences earned through repetition. Others stuck rigidly to tradition. Change felt unnecessary. They had already proven that their way worked. Neither approach was judged. Judgment required energy. And while that quietly carried on, carpets moved into places of quiet importance. Prayer rooms, council chambers, homes where decisions were made slowly. They softened sound. Conversations became gentler without anyone noticing why. They held warmth. They dulled echoes. They made rooms feel finished even when nothing else was. This influence was invisible. Carpets did not demand attention. They simply functioned. Chapter 5. When patience became a reputation. By the fifth carpet, patience was no longer just a personal trait. It was something others quietly noticed and named. Certain villages became known for taking their time. Merchants said it without criticism. Buyers repeated it without irony. They work slowly there, someone would say, meaning it as a guarantee rather than a warning. This reputation was earned unintentionally. No village held a meeting and decided to slow down. They simply continued working at the pace that made sense for wool, hands, and daylight. Over time, that pace became identifiable. And while that quietly carried on, trade routes rearranged themselves. Carpets traveled along paths that had existed long before the Ottoman Empire and continued long after it. Roads adjusted slightly. Borders shifted. Names changed. The movement of goods adapted without drama. A carpet might leave its place of origin and pass through several hands before reaching its final destination. Each exchange added a layer of distance between the weaver and the user. None of these intermediaries knew the individual who tied the knots. They did not need to. Paperwork accompanied the trade occasionally. More often, trust did. Reputation substituted for documentation. A region known for durable carpets did not need to explain itself. The weaver did not participate in these negotiations. Their role ended when the carpet left the room. Money returned slowly, sometimes reduced by expenses no one had mentioned beforehand. This was accepted with mild disappointment and little surprise. Negotiation fatigue was real. It was easier to keep weaving than to argue. And while that quietly carried on, patterns settled into habits. Designs that sold well were repeated. Borders that were recognized became familiar. This familiarity reassured buyers and exhausted historians centuries later. Variation still existed. It always did. Slight shifts in proportion. Unexpected color combinations when supplies changed. These differences were organic, not strategic. A weaver rarely stood back to admire the full carpet until it was finished. Even then, admiration was brief. The work had already been lived with for months or years. There were no revelations left. Carpets were judged more harshly by their own makers than by anyone else. Small flaws stood out painfully to the person who knew exactly where they were. Others rarely noticed. And while that quietly carried on, the idea of value evolved. In some periods, Ottoman carpets were highly prized. In others, they were simply one option among many. Demand fluctuated. Prices adjusted. None of this changed the weaving process itself. When prices fell, weavers wove anyway. When prices rose, they wove anyway. The loom did not respond to markets with enthusiasm or despair. It simply continued. Some households diversified, weaving less, farming more, or the reverse. The loom was adaptable in that way. It could wait if needed. Waiting was not wasted time. It was a known state. And while that quietly carried on, foreign eyes took interest. Travelers described carpets in journals. They marveled at color, density, labor. They speculated about meaning. They misunderstood frequently. Descriptions often exaggerated. Numbers were inflated. Timelines stretched. A carpet that took a year was said to take a lifetime. A lifetime of weaving was condensed into an afternoon's observation. The weavers were rarely consulted. They did not read these accounts. Their understanding of their own work remained practical. Later, collectors would romanticize the slowness. They would frame patience as wisdom, as spiritual discipline, as resistance to modernity. At the loom, patience was simply the absence of alternatives. And while that quietly carried on, small adaptations crept in. Metal tools replaced older wooden ones. Slight improvements in efficiency appeared. None of these changes disrupted the core rhythm. They smoothed it slightly. Thread was sometimes purchased rather than spun at home. This saved time but reduced control. Opinions differed. Some welcomed the convenience. Others distrusted it. These debates were quiet. No one wrote manifestos. And while that quietly carried on, the empire aged. Administrations reformed. Laws shifted. Languages mixed. The state attempted modernization in fits and starts. Some efforts reached the weaving room. Most did not. Taxes changed. Sometimes increased. Sometimes collected more aggressively. This caused irritation but not rebellion. Weaving was too embedded to be abandoned easily. Military events happened elsewhere. News arrived late. Reactions were subdued. The loom did not comment. And while that quietly carried on, carpets entered unexpected roles. They were used as wall insulation, as bedding, as makeshift doors, as room dividers. Their function expanded beyond the floor. When worn thin, they were repurposed, cut, sewn, layered. Nothing was discarded prematurely. This practical afterlife mattered more than aesthetic longevity. A carpet that survived 3 uses was considered successful. And while that quietly carried on, weavers aged further into familiarity. Hands no longer thought before moving. Movements shortened. Efficiency came not from speed but from elimination of unnecessary effort. Some weavers developed a reputation within their community. Others remained unnoticed. Neither status changed the work itself. Recognition, when it came, was understated. A nod, a comment, a preference expressed quietly. That was enough. By the time the 5th carpet ended, the loom felt less like an object and more like a fixture of existence. It had been there through enough change to become invisible. The finished carpet was removed, folded, set aside. Space opened briefly in the room. Then yarn was sorted again. Warp threads were prepared. Chapter 6. The quiet authority of repetition. By the 6th carpet, repetition had stopped feeling repetitive. The work no longer introduced itself as a task that needed completing. It was simply the thing that happened when the day began and the light was acceptable. The loom stood ready. Hands responded. There was no internal debate. Repetition carried a quiet authority. It decided posture. It shaped the muscles of the back and shoulders. It determined when breaks were taken, even without conscious planning. The body learned the sequence better than the mind ever could. People unfamiliar with weaving sometimes asked how boredom was avoided. This question never landed properly. Boredom assumed that the mind needed constant novelty. At the loom, the mind drifted freely because the hands were occupied. There was space for thought without pressure to produce it. Some thoughts were useful, others were not. Both were allowed. And while that quietly carried on, age altered perception. A young weaver often focused on the future of the carpet, how long it would take, when it would be finished. An older weaver thought less in those terms. The end was less important than the day's work being done properly. Time compressed in memory. Years blurred together. Carpets were remembered by where they were woven rather than when. The one by the window. The one during the cold winter. Chronology lost its sharp edges. The 6th carpet did not feel distinct from the 5th or the 7th. It was part of a continuous stretch of effort that resisted neat division. And while that quietly carried on, teaching became more deliberate. By this stage, someone else was usually working nearby. A younger person, a relative, an apprentice. Instruction happened without formal lessons. Correction came through gesture. A hand placed over another hand. A slight shake of the head. Language was inefficient for describing tension. It was easier to demonstrate and let muscle memory develop naturally. Frustration appeared occasionally, not dramatically, just a tightening of the mouth. A longer pause before correcting an error. These moments passed quickly. No one benefited from prolonged irritation. Progress in learning was slow. This was expected. Skill arrived gradually, then all at once, without warning. And while that quietly carried on, small rituals formed. Tea was prepared at roughly the same time each day. Cups were placed in the same spots. Tools were laid out in familiar arrangements. Disruptions to these routines were mildly irritating. Ritual did not imply reverence. It implied efficiency. Knowing where things were saved time and attention. The loom itself acquired habits. Certain pegs creaked more than others. One beam resisted adjustment slightly. These quirks were accommodated rather than fixed. Repair was undertaken only when necessary. Familiar flaws were preferable to unfamiliar improvements. And while that quietly carried on, the outside world pressed closer. Railways appeared in some regions. Steamships shortened routes. Carpets moved faster once they left the loom. This acceleration did not travel backward into the weaving room. Merchants began requesting specific sizes more frequently. Standardization crept in. Resistance followed quietly. Exact measurements were difficult to maintain when everything was done by hand. Compromise emerged. Approximate dimensions became acceptable. Close enough was formalized without being written down. And while that quietly carried on, the notion of authorship remained absent. No one signed a carpet. No one documented their contribution. Pride existed, but it was private. It lived in knowing that a knot would hold, that a color would age well. Recognition from others was unpredictable and unnecessary. Later generations would ask who made certain carpets. They would invent names. They would assign importance retroactively. The loom never acknowledged these efforts. And while that quietly carried on, weariness settled differently. Patterns evolved imperceptibly over time. A border might widen. A motif might shift slightly. Variations arose from experience and material constraints rather than conscious design. These small deviations became characteristic features, absorbed into the overall aesthetic without fanfare. And while that quietly carried on, the process of finishing a carpet remained deliberate. Borders were reinforced. Fringe was secured. Loose threads trimmed. The act was practical, not ceremonial. Each carpet, once completed, joined the accumulated history of its predecessors. Some were stored for years. Some sold immediately. Others were repurposed. Their influence in a space extended beyond decoration. They softened footsteps, absorbed conversation, provided warmth, and aged gracefully under repeated use. And while that quietly carried on, the loom remained central. Empty briefly, then reloaded. Threads arranged. Warp set. Knots waiting to be tied. Continuity was the primary law of the room. Time inside the weaving space was different from time outside. Days were fluid, measured in hands' movements, knots completed, rows advanced. Years layered naturally, observed more through work than calendars. Chapter 10. Knots as quiet witnesses. By the 10th carpet, every knot carried a subtle witness of time. Not the dramatic time measured by events or dates, but the patient, almost imperceptible accumulation of hours, days, and years. Each knot recorded the pressure of fingers, the pull of tension, the slow passing of light across the room. The weaver did not notice consciously. The knots remembered anyway. And while that quietly carried on, the rhythm of work had become second nature. Hands moved without deliberation. Eyes followed patterns automatically. The loom responded predictably. There was no rush, no impatience, and no excitement, only the steady, calm cadence of repetition. Small irregularities were absorbed silently. A loose knot here, a slightly faded thread there. These were not failures. They were signatures of the human presence, subtle markers of effort, endurance, and patience. Buyers rarely noticed them. The loom did. And while that quietly carried on, apprentices were integrated further into the process. They learned almost entirely through imitation. The slight guidance of an experienced hand, the gentle adjustment of posture, the small correction of tension. These were lessons transmitted directly through movement. Words were minimal. Observation was everything. Materials continued to assert themselves. Wool occasionally resisted the knotting process. Dyes settled differently than expected. Threads stretched, twisted, or frayed. These challenges were met with patience, with subtle adaptation, and with quiet endurance. No one hurried. Speed was irrelevant. Consistency was paramount, and while that quietly carried on, the loom had acquired a kind of character. It creaked, groaned, and shifted subtly under repeated use. Each sound was familiar, a quiet dialogue between wood and hands. The loom tolerated fatigue, errors, and the irregularity of human motion without complaint. It had no demands beyond patience. Time continued to flow differently inside the room. The light dictated attention more than schedules ever could. Morning indicated readiness. Midday allowed for steady rhythm. Evening prompted a natural slowdown. No clock or bell was required. The loom, yarn, and hands measured the day. And while that quietly carried on, societal recognition remained minimal. Carpets were identified more by region than individual weaver. Villages acquired reputations for slowness or consistency. Merchants learned to trust these reputations rather than inspect individual pieces too closely. Personal fame was rare. Private satisfaction was sufficient. Carpets accumulated quietly. Some traveled along trade routes to distant cities. Others remained local, layering floors, insulating walls, and softening sound. Some were reused, repurposed, or repaired. Their presence influenced space silently. Their wear recorded human activity without commentary. And while that quietly carried on, the work itself remained humble and deliberate. Borders were reinforced, fringe secured, loose threads trimmed. Each completed carpet joined the slow, unbroken chronology of the loom. There was no fanfare, no announcement, only the calm continuation of a process older than most who practiced it. The 10th carpet, like its predecessors, was completed without spectacle. Folded, moved, stored, or sold. The loom briefly empty, then readied again. Threads arranged, warps set, knots poised for action. Continuity remained absolute. Time in the weaving room did not obey calendars or clocks. It obeyed repetition, patience, and the quiet insistence of material reality. Days folded into carpets, and carpets folded into years. Chapter 11. The subtle negotiation of wool and hand. By the 11th carpet, weaving had become a subtle negotiation between wool and hand. The fibers resisted in small ways, twisting unexpectedly, fraying gently, or pulling tighter than anticipated. The weaver's fingers adapted without thought, adjusting tension, correcting slight misalignments, and continuing the work with minimal interruption. The negotiation was quiet, unspoken, and ongoing. And while that quietly carried on, the loom itself had acquired a sort of silent authority. It dictated pace without overt commands. It creaked in familiar spots. Pegs resisted slightly. Beams shifted under the weight of accumulated tension. Each sound was recognized and anticipated. There was no frustration, only understanding. The loom and the weaver had reached a tacit agreement. Work proceeded at the rate that was possible, not the rate that was demanded. Patterns remained mostly consistent, but slight variations appeared over decades. A flower leaned in a slightly different direction. A border widened by a single thread. A color deepened unexpectedly after the yarn had been exposed to light and air. These variations were not deliberate innovation. They were traces of patience, time, and human presence, woven into the fabric without fanfare. And while that quietly carried on, the rhythm of repetition dominated experience. The weaver's body moved without conscious thought. Fingers tied knots. Eyes followed threads. Wrists rotated in familiar sequences. There was no need to plan, only to continue. The body remembered what the mind did not need to command. Apprentices, if present, absorbed this rhythm almost unconsciously. Watching, copying, mimicking. Occasional correction from a guiding hand. A slight adjustment of tension. A reminder to hold the yarn differently. Words were minimal, often unnecessary. Knowledge was transmitted directly through movement, repetition, and patience. And while that quietly carried on, time moved differently inside the weaving room than outside. Light was a subtle regulator. Morning sunlight prompted activity. Afternoon shadows suggested gradual slowing. Evening darkness brought natural cessation. Clocks and schedules were irrelevant. The loom and the hands dictated time. Physical endurance remained quietly central. Hands thickened. Joints stiffened. Eyes adjusted to the exacting work. The back curved imperceptibly. Fatigue was acknowledged silently. Pauses were brief and self-regulated. Work resumed naturally once the body was ready. No drama, no complaints. Only continuity. And while that quietly carried on, small rituals became ingrained. Tea was prepared and consumed at the same times. Tools were arranged in habitual order. Threads were sorted predictably. Minor deviations caused brief discomfort but did not disrupt the rhythm. Routine was both functional and soothing. The outside world intruded only peripherally. Traders delivered orders. Markets shifted subtly. News arrived. Carpets traveled along trade routes to distant locations. All of this mattered little inside the room. The loom, yarn, and hands dictated primary attention. Speed, demand, and urgency from beyond were tolerated but never fully integrated. And while that quietly carried on, carpets accumulated layered histories. Borders recorded subtle shifts. Colors whispered seasonal variations. Patterns held memories of conversations, pauses, and private reflection. The weaver did not acknowledge this consciously. The work itself remembered for them. Carpets completed the familiar cycle. Borders were finished, fringe secured, loose ends trimmed. The loom emptied briefly, then prepared again. Warp was set. Threads arranged. Knots awaited fingers. Continuity remained absolute. Time inside the weaving room did not follow calendars or clocks. It followed the cadence of repetition, the quiet insistence of material, and the patient negotiation between hand and wool. Chapter 12. The slow diplomacy of color. By the 12th carpet, color itself had become a subtle form of diplomacy. Reds, blues, yellows, and neutrals negotiated with one another on the field of the carpet, asserting dominance, softening, or retreating according to how the wool behaved. The dye settled, and the light touched each thread. The weaver mediated quietly, rarely intervening except to nudge a knot slightly tighter or to adjust a tension that had begun to rebel. And while that quietly carried on, patterns continued their understated persistence. Borders repeated themselves with minor, almost imperceptible variation. Motifs leaned slightly left or right, petals opened a hair differently, corners rotated by a thread or two. These differences were neither mistakes nor deliberate innovation. They were the soft fingerprints of time, patience, and human presence. The loom continued to speak in its creaks, knocks, and soft protests. Each sound was familiar, anticipated, integrated into the rhythm. The weaver's hands responded automatically. Movement, tension, and pattern flowed together in a quiet, uninterrupted conversation that required no words. Apprentices absorbed these lessons indirectly, watching, copying, adjusting. They learned less from verbal instruction and more from the physical dialogue of hands, threads, and rhythm. Small corrections were conveyed silently. A hand placed over theirs, a slight pressure change, a subtle guidance of the knot. Mastery was internalized, almost imperceptibly. And while that quietly carried on, light continued to govern activity. Morning prompted readiness. Afternoon suggested slower progress. Evening encouraged pause. No clock was required. The room operated according to the gentle flow of natural time, the loom and hands enforcing their own subtle schedule. Fatigue and endurance were quietly measured. Hands thickened and stiffened. Fingers adapted. Eyes compensated by moving closer to the work. Backs curved. The body accommodated the labor without complaint. Pauses were integrated naturally, dictated by awareness rather than urgency. And while that quietly carried on, small rituals solidified. Tea was prepared and consumed at precise moments. Tools were returned to habitual locations. Yarn was sorted consistently. Slight disruptions were tolerated but subtly irksome. Routine was a stabilizing force, both functional and comforting. The wider world intruded minimally. Merchants brought requests for specific colors or dimensions. Traders and letters arrived sporadically. Carpets traveled along roads that stretched far beyond the village. These intrusions were noted, accommodated, but never allowed to dominate the rhythm inside the room. The loom, yarn, and hands remained central. And while that quietly carried on, the passage of time became inscribed in subtle ways. Borders became slightly worn. Colors softened in sunlit areas. Threads acquired gentle irregularities. Carpets remembered use, age, and touch silently, without drama or complaint. Each completed carpet joined the accumulated history of its predecessors. Fringe was secured, loose ends trimmed, borders reinforced. The loom stood empty for a brief moment before new warp was prepared, threads arranged, and the next series of knots awaited. Time within the weaving room flowed differently than outside. It was governed by repetition, patience, and the slow diplomacy of materials, rather than clocks, deadlines, or calendars. Carpets accumulated, patterns persisted, and the work continued with quiet inevitability. Chapter 13. The Soft Mathematics of Pattern. By the 13th carpet, the weaver's mind had begun to operate in a quiet arithmetic of pattern. Not the formal numbers of trade or accounts, but a soft, internal mathematics. Rows counted themselves. Repeats and borders aligned almost automatically. The hand anticipated the next not as though the pattern existed independently of conscious thought. Each repetition a subtle calculation carried out without effort. And while that quietly carried on, slight variations continued to appear. A motif might tilt fractionally. A flower petal might expand unevenly. A border might widen or contract by a thread. None of this was considered a mistake. Each subtle deviation recorded time, patience, and human presence, woven into the carpet silently. Buyers rarely noticed, but these small differences made each carpet unique, carrying a private signature of those who tied the knots. The loom remained steady and predictable, creaking in familiar spots, resisting adjustments just enough to maintain attention without interruption. Its minor protests were part of the dialogue between hands and material. Every squeak, every soft knock, became a cue. The rhythm of work unfolded like a slow conversation between wood and human, sustained for hours without the need for speech. Apprentices learned primarily through imitation. Their observations absorbed into muscle memory, their errors corrected gently by subtle guidance. A touch on the wrist, a repositioning of fingers. Knowledge was conveyed less by instruction and more by experience. Mastery arrived as a quiet internalization rather than an externally acknowledged achievement. And while that quietly carried on, the rhythm of light continued to dictate the day. Morning prompted the readiness of hands. Afternoon encouraged slow, steady work. Evening signaled natural pause. No clock or external schedule was required. The room and its occupants moved in synchrony with the sun, the loom serving as mediator between time and labor. Physical endurance remained a quiet but ever-present factor. Hands thickened and stiffened. Fingers learned subtle compensations. Eyes adjusted to the fine demands of the work. Backs curved. Minor aches were acknowledged silently. Pauses were self-directed, not imposed. Resumed naturally once the body was ready, without fanfare. And while that quietly carried on, the weaver developed increasingly subtle rituals. Tea was prepared and consumed at predictable moments. Tools returned consistently to their habitual positions. Yarn was sorted with methodical care. Small disturbances were noted but quickly accommodated. Routine was both functional and stabilizing, providing a comforting structure within the day's labor. The outside world intruded sporadically, with merchants requesting specific dimensions or colors, letters arriving, or carpets traveling distant routes. These events were observed and accommodated but did not dominate the rhythm inside the room. The loom, yarn, and hands remained central, unbothered by external urgency. And while that quietly carried on, carpets silently recorded history. Borders showed subtle wear. Colors softened under sunlight. Threads bore evidence of touch and age. Carpets remembered usage without complaint. They became instruments of memory, quietly chronicling the accumulation of human presence over years. When each carpet was completed, borders reinforced, fringe secured, loose threads trimmed. The loom was empty briefly before being readied for the next project. Warp set, threads arranged, knots poised for the next patient sequence. Continuity remained unbroken. Time inside the weaving room followed the cadence of repetition and endurance rather than calendars, clocks, or deadlines. Carpets accumulated, patterns persisted, and work continued with quiet inevitability. Chapter 14. The almost imperceptible dialogue of threads. By the 14th carpet, the work had deepened into an almost imperceptible dialogue between threads, hands, and loom. Each strand of wool seemed to convey information about tension, previous knots, and subtle resistance. The weaver's fingers responded intuitively, adjusting pressure and alignment without conscious deliberation. The room itself seemed to participate, quiet and attentive, filled only with the low hum of routine movement and the soft creaks of wood. And while that quietly carried on, slight deviations continued to emerge, natural and unremarkable. A motif might shift a fraction of a thread's width. A color blend might subtly differ from the previous carpet. None of these were considered errors. They were evidence of the ongoing, patient negotiation between human and material of the long history embedded in repeated motions. The loom retained its quiet authority. Each squeak, knock, and creak was understood by the weaver as part of the conversation, neither disruptive nor commanding. The room's rhythm was governed by these soft cues, the loom acting as a patient intermediary between human effort and material resistance. Apprentices, if present, absorbed knowledge almost entirely through observation and imitation. A finger slightly repositioned, a wrist gently guided. Correction was subtle, almost invisible. Words were secondary, unnecessary. Learning was absorbed, internalized, and expressed in movement rather than explanation. And while that quietly carried on, light remained a regulator. Morning sunlight suggested readiness. Afternoon shadows encouraged steady pacing. Evening dimming prompted natural cessation. Time within the weaving room was measured not by clocks but by hands, knots, and the gradual fading of light. Physical endurance continued to shape experience. Fingers thickened and stiffened, eyes adjusted, backs curved slightly. Minor aches were recognized without complaint. Pauses were integrated seamlessly. Work resumed naturally when the body permitted. No drama, no announcement, only continuity. And while that quietly carried on, rituals deepened. Tea was consumed at familiar times, cups placed consistently, tools and threads arranged predictably. Slight disturbances were tolerated with mild irritation but no disruption. Routine was both functional and quietly comforting. Outside events intruded minimally. Merchants delivered requests, letters arrived, carpets traveled distant routes. All of this was accommodated, noted, but never allowed to dominate the rhythm within the room. The loom, yarn, and hands maintained centrality. External urgency was peripheral. And while that quietly carried on, carpets silently recorded history. Borders bore slight wear. Colors softened with time. Threads retained traces of touch. Carpets became subtle markers of human presence, documenting labor, endurance, and patience without fanfare. Each carpet, when finished, underwent the familiar process. Borders were reinforced, fringe secured, loose threads trimmed. The loom was briefly empty before warp was prepared again. Threads were arranged, knots poised for action. Continuity persisted. Time inside the weaving room remained distinct from the outside world. It flowed according to repetition, endurance, and the quiet insistence of material. Carpets accumulated. Patterns persisted. Work continued with inevitable regularity. Chapter 15. The Patient Architecture of Fringe. By the 15th carpet, attention had turned almost instinctively to fringe. Fringe was never trivial. It marked the edges of labor, the boundary between the finished work and the waiting loom. Each knot securing the fringe demanded care, patience, and repetition, echoing the long hours of weaving that had come before. The act was methodical, deliberate, almost meditative. And while that quietly carried on, patterns continued their quiet persistence. Borders and motifs repeated with minor, imperceptible variations. A floral design might lean differently, a geometric line might diverge by a single thread. These deviations were not mistakes. They were gentle signatures of the weaver's body, of time, and of the slow negotiation with material. Each carpet held its own private narrative, readable only to those who had tied the knots. The loom remained a silent interlocutor. Its familiar creaks and knocks guided hands with precision. Every subtle sound communicated position, tension, and timing. The conversation between human and machine, wood and wool, was ongoing, unspoken, and uninterrupted. Apprentices continued to learn without instruction. Observation and imitation remained the primary methods of education. Fingers were guided gently, wrists adjusted slightly, knots corrected almost invisibly. Words were minimal. Experience was absorbed. Mastery emerged quietly, without acknowledgement or announcement. And while that quietly carried on, the influence of light persisted. Morning encouraged readiness. Afternoon signaled steady rhythm. Evening suggested natural pause. No clock or schedule was necessary. The loom, the hands, and the sun maintained the pace. Physical endurance dictated subtler adjustments. Fingers thickened, joints stiffened. Eyes moved closer to the work, backs curved. Fatigue was acknowledged silently. Breaks occurred naturally. Work resumed when the body allowed. Continuity was the only law. And while that quietly carried on, small rituals deepened further. Tea consumed at precise times. Tools returned to their habitual places. Yarn sorted with exacting consistency. Slight disruptions were noticed but adapted to with minimal irritation. Routine was stabilizing and comforting, as much a part of labor as nodding itself. The outside world intruded occasionally. Merchants delivered specifications. Carpets traveled trade routes. Letters arrived sporadically. These events were accommodated but never allowed. The outside world intruded occasionally. Merchants delivered specifications. Carpets traveled trade routes. Letters arrived sporadically. These events were accommodated but never allowed to dominate the internal rhythm. The loom and the hands remained central, patient, and unmoved. And while that quietly carried on, carpets accumulated histories silently. Borders bore gentle wear. Colors softened subtly. Threads carried evidence of repeated handling. Carpets remembered presence, movement, and care without conscious acknowledgement. They were living chronicles of human patience. Completion followed the familiar rhythm. Borders reinforced. Fringe secured. Loose threads trimmed. The loom emptied briefly, then prepared for the next warp. Threads arranged, knots poised. Continuity resumed. Time within the weaving room flowed differently than in the outside world. It was measured by repetition, endurance, and material response, not by clocks or calendars. Carpets layered history over time. Patterns persisted. Work continued quietly, inevitably. Chapter 16. The invisible weight of color transitions. By the 16th carpet, the subtle negotiation between colors had become almost imperceptible. The weaver's eyes moved slowly across the field, anticipating the next shade, the next transition from deep red to muted gold, from blue to soft green. Each change was handled delicately, without haste, allowing the threads to settle naturally into place. The work was deliberate, and the colors themselves seemed to participate, blending with patience, shifting imperceptibly under hands that knew them intimately. And while that quietly carried on, patterns continued their gentle evolution. Motifs repeated with minor variations. A leaf might curl slightly differently. A geometric line might drift a fraction of a thread. These differences were not deliberate innovations but traces of time, endurance, and human presence. The carpet carried them without complaint, quietly preserving the story of its creation. The loom, ever patient, continued its soft communication. Its creaks, gentle knocks, and subtle resistance guided the hands. The dialogue between wood and wool remained unspoken but understood. Every sound marked a place, a moment, a motion, and the rhythm unfolded uninterrupted. Apprentices continued to learn by immersion. They watched and mimicked, absorbing lessons silently. Hands were guided subtly. Tension corrected gently. Errors were integrated into understanding rather than criticized. Knowledge was transmitted through rhythm, repetition, and observation. Mastery emerged quietly, recognized only internally. And while that quietly carried on, light maintained its quiet governance. Morning provided readiness. Afternoon encouraged steady pacing. Evening prompted natural cessation. No external clocks were necessary. The loom and the hands synchronized with the flow of sunlight, and the room existed in its own unhurried measure of time. Physical endurance continued to shape labor. Fingers thickened. Joints stiffened. Eyes moved closer. Backs curved slightly. Minor aches were tolerated silently. Pauses occurred naturally. Work resumed seamlessly when the body permitted. There was no drama, only continuation. And while that quietly carried on, rituals deepened further. Tea consumed at precise intervals. Tools returned consistently to habitual locations. Yarn sorted predictably. Small disturbances were noted but absorbed with minimal irritation. Routine provided structure, comfort, and continuity. The outside world intruded only peripherally. Merchants delivered specifications. Carpets traveled trade routes. Letters arrived sporadically. These events were accommodated but never dictated the rhythm of work inside the room. The loom and the hands remained central, patient, and immovable. And while that quietly carried on, the carpets silently chronicled time. Orders bore wear. Colors softened subtly. Threads recorded touch, tension, and passage of light. Each carpet remembered human presence without complaint. They were private histories of labor, patience, and endurance. Completion followed the familiar ritual. Borders reinforced. Fringe secured. Loose threads trimmed. The loom emptied briefly, then prepared for the next warp. Threads arranged. Knots poised. Continuity resumed. Time within the weaving room existed differently than outside. It was measured by repetition, endurance, and subtle negotiation between hand, thread, and loom. Carpets accumulated. Patterns persisted. Work continued quietly, inevitably. Chapter 17. The Gentle Discipline of Tension. By the 17th carpet, the weaver had developed an almost instinctive understanding of tension. Not just the pull of individual threads, but the broader balance across the entire field. Each knot demanded a precise pressure, not too tight, not too loose, so that the finished carpet would settle evenly, with subtle firmness in some areas and gentle flexibility in others. This knowledge had become second nature, embedded in the hands and body, rather than something consciously calculated. And while that quietly carried on, patterns maintained their patient continuity. Borders repeated themselves with tiny, almost invisible variations. Motifs leaned or shifted fractionally, creating a rhythm that was recognizably human but entirely natural. These differences were unremarkable to outsiders but carried the quiet testimony of time, patience, and lived experience. The loom continued its role as a silent partner. Its creaks, knocks, and gentle resistance were understood instinctively. Wood and wool, hands and knots, existed in a dialogue without words. Each sound indicated position, movement, or tension, guiding the weaver with patient consistency. Apprentices absorbed these lessons through careful observation. Fingers were guided subtly, wrists adjusted slightly, knots corrected quietly. Instructions were minimal. Learning was transmitted through the body, not the mouth. Mastery arrived silently, internalized rather than announced. And while that quietly carried on, light dictated the day's rhythm. Morning suggested readiness. Afternoon supported steady pacing. Evening encouraged natural cessation. Time was measured not by clocks, but by sun, shadow, and the loom's silent signals. Physical endurance shaped experience further. Fingers thickened, joints stiffened. Eyes adjusted to the demanding work. Backs curved gradually. Minor aches were acknowledged silently. Pauses occurred naturally, and work resumed seamlessly. Continuity required no dramatics, only patience and attention. And while that quietly carried on, small rituals reinforced stability. Tea was prepared and consumed at familiar moments. Tools returned to habitual positions. Yarn was sorted predictably. Minor disruptions were accommodated with minimal irritation. Routine was functional, stabilizing, and quietly reassuring. The wider world intruded lightly. Merchants delivered specifications. Carpets traveled distant routes. Letters arrived. These events were noted and incorporated peripherally but did not dominate the rhythm within the room. The loom and hands remained central, patient, and unhurried. And while that quietly carried on, carpets recorded subtle histories. Borders bore wear. Colors softened gradually. Threads retained traces of handling and light. Carpets preserved memory, quietly chronicling patience, labor, and human presence. Completion followed familiar ritual. Borders reinforced. Fringe secured. Loose threads trimmed. The loom emptied briefly, then prepared again. Warp set. Threads arranged. Knots poised for the next patient sequence. Continuity resumed. Time inside the weaving room was governed by repetition, endurance, and the gentle discipline of tension rather than clocks or schedules. Carpets accumulated. Patterns persisted. Work continued with quiet inevitability. Chapter 18. The Quiet Patience of Dye. By the 18th carpet, the influence of dye had become an intimate companion. Colors were no longer merely aesthetic. They demanded observation, understanding, and patience. Some shades required repeated soaking to reach their intended depth. Others shifted subtly over days, responding to temperature, humidity, and exposure to light. The weaver did not rush. Each hue was coaxed into place slowly, treated with quiet attention, and integrated gently into the pattern. And while that quietly carried on, patterns maintained their gentle continuity. Motifs repeated with imperceptible variations. Borders expanded or contracted by threads almost unnoticed. Leaves, flowers, and geometric shapes shifted slightly from carpet to carpet, carrying the memory of hands, hours, and patience. These subtleties were rarely appreciated by outsiders but marked the work with private testimony of human presence. The loom continued its understated guidance. Its creaks and knocks communicated position, tension, and sequence. The dialogue between wood and wool persisted silently. The weaver's hands responded instinctively. No words were necessary. The room moved in quiet synchronization with the loom's gentle authority. Apprentices absorbed understanding almost entirely through imitation. Fingers were guided, wrists adjusted, and knots corrected subtly. Instruction relied on demonstration rather than explanation. Knowledge passed quietly from body to body. Mastery emerged internally, unspoken, unacknowledged externally. And while that quietly carried on, light governed activity. Morning suggested readiness. Afternoon encouraged steady work. Evening prompted natural pause. Time inside the room was measured by repetition, observation, and the subtle cues of sunlight, not by external schedules. Physical endurance continued to shape practice. Fingers thickened, joints stiffened, backs curved. Eyes adapted to the demanding work. Minor aches were recognized silently. Pauses occurred naturally. Work resumed seamlessly. Continuity required only patience and awareness, no drama. And while that quietly carried on, rituals deepened further. Tea consumed at familiar times. Tools and threads returned to habitual positions. Yarn sorted predictably. Slight disruptions were tolerated, accommodated without fuss. Routine stabilized the day, provided structure, and reinforced focus. The outside world intruded softly. Merchants delivered specific requests. Carpets traveled along distant routes. Letters arrived. These events were noted, accommodated peripherally, but did not dictate the rhythm within the weaving room. The loom, yarn, and hands remained central. External urgency was secondary. And while that quietly carried on, carpets silently preserved time. Borders bore gentle wear. Colors softened gradually. Threads recorded handling, light exposure, and the passing of hours. Carpets became private chronicles of labor, endurance, and quiet attention. Completion followed the familiar process. Borders reinforced. Fringe secured. Loose threads trimmed. The loom stood empty briefly, then warp was prepared again. Threads arranged. Knots poised. Continuity resumed. Time inside the weaving room existed according to repetition, endurance, and the patient negotiation of color rather than calendars or schedules. Carpets accumulated. Patterns persisted. Work continued with quiet inevitability. Chapter 19. The unnoticed choreography of knots. By the 19th carpet, the act of tying knots had become an unnoticed choreography. Fingers moved with precision that no longer required conscious thought. Each hand knew exactly when to push, pull, or twist. Eyes anticipated placement. The loom responded predictably. There was no urgency, no concern about progress, only the steady, deliberate cadence of repeated action. And while that quietly carried on, minor variations continued to emerge, entirely natural and almost imperceptible. A motif might lean fractionally, a border might widen by a thread or two. These were not errors, but subtle signatures of time, patience, and human attention. The carpet carried them silently, integrating them into its ongoing story without acknowledgement or fanfare. The loom remained an ever-present partner. Its creaks and groans guided hands. Each sound marked position, tension, or alignment. The dialogue between weaver and loom was continuous, unspoken, and deeply familiar. Every movement, adjustment, and correction was conducted within this quiet understanding. Apprentices, if present, continued to absorb knowledge almost entirely through observation. Fingers guided, wrists adjusted, knots corrected subtly. Words were minimal. Learning was absorbed physically and unconsciously. Mastery emerged internally, unannounced, recognized only by the hands themselves. And while that quietly carried on, light dictated pace. Morning prompted readiness, afternoon suggested steady rhythm, and evening encouraged natural pause. No clock was required. The sun and the loom orchestrated the day, and the room moved in quiet accordance with their cues. Physical endurance persisted as an invisible force. Fingers thickened and stiffened. Joints accommodated repeated motion. Eyes moved closer to the threads. Backs curved subtly. Minor aches were acknowledged and accepted. Pauses occurred naturally. Work resumed seamlessly, without drama or fanfare. Continuity alone mattered. And while that quietly carried on, rituals became more ingrained. Tea consumed at exact times. Tools returned consistently to familiar positions. Yarn sorted predictably. Minor disruptions tolerated with mild irritation, but never enough to break rhythm. Routine was both functional and comforting, stabilizing the day and the labor within it. The outside world intruded minimally. Merchants delivered orders. Carpets traveled distant routes. Letters arrived sporadically. These events were acknowledged but did not dominate the work inside the room. The loom and the hands remained central, patient, and immovable. External urgency was peripheral, almost irrelevant. And while that quietly carried on, carpets preserved subtle histories. Borders bore gentle wear. Colors softened gradually. Threads carried traces of handling and light. Each carpet became a silent record of human presence, endurance, and persistent labor, chronicling the slow accumulation of time. Completion followed the familiar ritual. Borders reinforced. Fringe secured. Loose threads trimmed. The loom stood empty briefly, then prepared for the next warp. Threads arranged. Knots poised. Continuity resumed effortlessly. Time inside the weaving room moved differently than outside. It was measured by repetition, endurance, and the unnoticed choreography of knots rather than calendars, clocks, or schedules. Carpets accumulated. Patterns persisted. Work continued with quiet inevitability. Chapter 20. The quiet rhythm of warp and weft. By the 20th carpet, the fundamental dialogue between warp and weft had become almost imperceptible, an internal rhythm that the weaver no longer noticed consciously. Warp threads stretched tautly across the loom, steady and patient. Weft threads were interlaced with deliberate care, guided by hands that knew exactly when to push, pull, or tighten. The room existed in the gentle hum of repetition, each motion predictable, steady, and unhurried. And while that quietly carried on, patterns continued to evolve slowly. Minor variations persisted, natural and inevitable. A corner might shift slightly. A geometric line might widen by a thread. Petals, leaves, and borders adjusted by the subtlest degrees. These were not mistakes, nor attempts at innovation. They were the quiet signatures of time, endurance, and human attention woven into each carpet without ceremony or acknowledgement. The loom remained the ever-present partner. Its creaks, knocks, and gentle resistance provided subtle guidance. Each sound indicated position, tension, or motion, facilitating a silent conversation between hands and machine. The dialogue was unspoken but continuous, integrated seamlessly into the rhythm of labor. Apprentices, if present, continued to learn entirely through observation and imitation. Fingers were guided subtly, wrists adjusted gently, knots corrected silently. Words were minimal. Learning was absorbed physically, internalized quietly, and expressed through action rather than speech. Mastery emerged unannounced, recognized only by the hands themselves. And while that quietly carried on, light dictated the day's cadence. Morning sunlight suggested readiness. Afternoon shadows encouraged steady work. Evening dimming prompted natural pause. Clocks and external schedules were irrelevant. The loom, threads, and sun orchestrated the day naturally. Physical endurance remained quietly central. Fingers thickened. Joints stiffened. Eyes moved closer to the threads. Backs curved slightly. Minor aches were acknowledged without complaint. Pauses occurred organically. Work resumed seamlessly. Continuity required no drama, only patience, attention, and subtle adaptation. And while that quietly carried on, small rituals continued to reinforce stability. Tea consumed at familiar times. Tools returned consistently to habitual positions. Yarn sorted predictably. Slight disturbances were absorbed with minimal irritation. Routine was functional, stabilizing, and quietly comforting, a framework for uninterrupted labor. The outside world intruded rarely and gently. Merchants delivered orders. Carpets traveled along distant trade routes. Letters arrived. These events were acknowledged, incorporated peripherally, but never dominated the internal rhythm. The loom and hands remained central, patient, and immovable. External urgency was secondary, tolerated but not absorbed. And while that quietly carried on, carpets silently preserved subtle histories. Borders bore gentle wear. Colors softened with exposure. Threads recorded touch, tension, and light. Each carpet became a quiet chronicle of human presence, endurance, and persistent labor, documenting the accumulation of time. Completion followed the familiar routine. Borders reinforced. Fringe secured. Loose threads trimmed. The loom stood empty briefly, then warp was prepared anew. Threads arranged. Knots poised. Continuity resumed effortlessly. Time inside the weaving room followed repetition, endurance, and the quiet rhythm of warp and weft rather than calendars or clocks. Carpets accumulated. Patterns persisted. Work continued with quiet inevitability. By the end of the 20th carpet, there was no fanfare, no recognition. Only the loom's patient silence, the steady rhythm of warp and weft, and the knowledge that the 21st carpet was already forming in thought, waiting for hands to resume their slow, deliberate, unhurried motion.